You're listening to Nothing's New on GNAT-TV, a historical podcast connecting the past to the present with Paige Vignola, Shawn Harrington, and Andrew McKeever. Okay, well, we're back with another edition of Nothing's New, our history podcast where we explore historical events and connect them to maybe present-day events or things that happened before or after, kind of a through line through the centuries, if you will, and basically helps us to, we hope anyway, understand some of the present-day things or recent past stuff because we can look back and see those historical antecedents. So it's a pleasure to be here today with Shawn Harrington, the curator at the Manchester Historical Society. Our good buddy Paige Vignola, who is normally here with us, is unable to be with us here today, but we'll make sure we have her back next time around because Paige's contributions are always highly invaluable. Would you agree, Shawn?
Absolutely. Well, right now we are a two-legged stool instead of a three-legged stool.
That's right. Two-legged stool can get a little tippy, right?
That's right.
Well, we don't want that to go on forever. So, Paige, we'll see you next time around. Anyway, well, I guess we're going to kind of continue a little bit with what we've been talking about in terms of the 250th commemoration events that are going to be coming up pretty soon. And, we've been talking about, the Revolutionary era and how a lot of the events of that period in 1760, 1770 into 1780s, really was influenced very heavily by British and French interactions, not only in the European continent, but also over here in North America, or what we now refer to as North America. I guess they didn't have that nomenclature at the time, but I guess Shawn, when we left it off, we were going to talk a little bit about the Green Mountain Boys because they're sort of the central cast of characters. I guess we're going to be dealing with as we take our people up Route 7 to Castleton and then on to Fort Ticonderoga. Green Mountain Boys were started basically growing out of that whole issue between the New Hampshire grants and the New York grants, where these were the settlers who came up from Connecticut mostly, some from Massachusetts as well, and they were settling the Bennington County and the immediate area, and had bought the property from Benning Wentworth, the governor of New Hampshire, and the governor of New York says, "Wait a minute, that's my land. You can buy it, you can have it, but you got to pay me first."
Right. And then to make things, to complicate matters a little bit more, it's like, King George then kind of rules in 1764 after people had already started settling the areas and transactions had happened. And he was a little vague about, his ruling of saying New York extended to the Connecticut River. And, consequently what happened was, New York said, okay, well, great. Well, we don't want to displace the settlers, so they can just, they can buy it again. So basically they were, the proposal that was on the table for the people who would come here, clear the land, brought their families was, you've paid for the purchase of your property to New Hampshire. Well, now you can pay for the same property again to New York. So it caused consternation. Now,
why wouldn't they do that?
Why? Yeah.
Big problem.
And Bennington County in particular, just because of our proximity to Albany, kind of was a flashpoint. And, and so when we think of today, you think Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. Well, who were they? And I mean, we know some of the, there's been a tremendous amount of work by the descendants of the Green Mountain Boys, the work that they've done with genealogists and, of who they were and documented to the best they can. Because again, when we come back to documentation, okay, so today if we want to go to Google or ChatGPT, or if we even go back to our library books, if you go to the Manchester Community Library and go sit down in the Vermont room, there's a lot of books about Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys and the early formation of Vermont. And as we've learned, as we move along, and not to say that we've become woke in any kind of, ideological sense, but, more is always revealed as you go through, as documents get discovered and people really find out, well, this is what was really happening back then. But everything was written down. Nothing was being, there were no emails. I mean, everything was, and, the Green Mountain Boys, they were farmers. For all intents and purposes, they were farmers. And, their arms were their hunting rifles. I mean, essentially, this wasn't a, it was a militia, but militias in their stance, I mean, they were the everyday people who lived in the community and would band together because there was no law, so to speak. There was no police station. There were no sheriffs. I mean, there were constables to a degree, and yes, there were sheriffs, but not in what this would be considered kind of like frontier land. So, the boys, as they were called, I mean, they kind of banded together, and Ethan was, he was, from everything that I've read, from accounts of, who he was, from his own writings. I mean, obviously, Ethan had a very high opinion of himself, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, but he was a very, very assured, very intelligent man. We don't actually know what he looked like. We knew that he was tall. Even the statuary hall down in Washington, D.C., and the statue that's at our Capitol building in Montpelier, and even our statue right here in Manchester Village, which is supposed to be a likeness of Ethan Allen, because it's only a likeness because no surviving portraits from the time exist of him, which, again, circling back, it's like, so how do we pull this whole narrative together for Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys? Well, a lot of it's word of mouth, oral history. There are letters, hard copy, tangible letters that have survived and are continually discovered, rediscovered, I should say. But a lot of the narrative, we have general ideas of what happened. We know that they were formed around 1770. We know it was Ethan Allen. We know it was Remember Baker and, the cousins, Seth Warner. They were the leadership, and their tactics, which, all the accounts I've read, whether it be Ethan's accounts, more contemporary accounts, the fact that they were based in Bennington, but they covered all of Bennington County, all the way up to Rutland, Clarendon, that they could be there on a quote-unquote moment's notice. Well, they weren't jumping in, their Chevy and driving. I mean, they were either on foot or on horseback. So crisscrossing Bennington County when you're walking or riding on a horse, and doing it in a band of, anywhere from 10 or 12 to maybe a little more, was impressive for the time. Do we have accounts of every place they went and everything they did? No, we have some highlights. A lot of that Ethan had recalled, other members of the boys had recalled, or complaints that, that the settlers, say the New Yorkers who came over and settled, then the Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys show up, or the Green Mountain Boys show up and they're thrown away and they go back to New York and do their reports. So we have reports of what happened. And of course, those reports are always skewed, because if you are the one being thrown off the land, if you're from New York, then, well, you're not going to have a very high opinion of those Green Mountain Boys. Whereas the Green Mountain Boys, they looked at it, they were protecting their lands. So it's interesting to look back on it 250 plus years later to say, well, what's the story? And the answer to me when I read these, they're both right. I mean, there are two, completely different objectives and two trains of thought, and none of them were wrong. Neither one of them are wrong, because the king never really was said for sure what happened. Was the envelope pushed by everyone? I mean, have we seen that happen since then?
I think once or twice.
Once or twice.
Or more.
So is the idea that who they were and what they represented, they were protecting their interests. Yeah. Ultimately, is what it boils down, protecting their families. And that, to me, is, that's as old as, when people had families to protect.
So it was a real open frontier where basically, the government, or such as it was at the time, really hadn't kind of zoned out where the rules where formal authority began and ended, and when people who were just moving into this frontier settled area could kind of do their own thing, and they had their little property parcel, and that was basically it. Yeah, exactly. And if you look at our original plot map, our colonial plot map, it's on a piece of leather. I think I mentioned this before up at Town Hall. I've gone look, and it's barely legible today. Because, well, people didn't have nice, books where they wrote everything down nice and clear. They wrote on what was available. And when you look at our very early town records, and, the town clerk did a wonderful job of preserving these records. And you can actually go up and look at, some of the first town meeting notes. They still exist. You can go in and look at them, and it's very hard to read some of them. Some of the pages are ripped and there's holes in them, but they do exist.
But even going back to what the land records are from here, so Manchester's 36 square miles, 6 by 6 square, basically 6 miles by 6 miles. And it was broken down into 100-acre lots sold to people that or granted to people who never came here, and so they turned around and sold it to people, and then they turned around. So the land itself wasn't even the surveys weren't even complete. So our former curator of the historical site, Wesley Hill, who's a phenomenal man, he actually, I don't know how many hours he spent in the town clerk's office going through land records, trying to recreate, going back through the several tranches of buyers and sellers, of trying to figure out, well, where were these original plots, these original grants, and then how were they sold up and how were they divided up? And some of the outlying areas he was able to figure out pretty well, but then there's entire patches of the map. He drew it all by hand, where they're just blank, because it just it's like, they divided it up and sold it off before it was even surveyed, and then the surveys were, 3 links from the maple tree to, the big rock. When you read the land records, it's like, oh my God.
Wow. And that's history that can never really be, told for sure.
Reconciled, for sure, right. But they were doing what they had to. And again, so you had this 5-year period, from 1770 to 1775, where this militia, not formally trained by any means, I mean, and I should back up. I mean, some of them had experience from the French and Indian War, so they certainly knew tactics, and the tactics that they learned from the natives. So it was more of a type of a guerrilla warfare, so to speak. And I shouldn't, and I'm using that as just a broad, general sense. Certainly not the Napoleonic tactics that we would know, where they line up or like the Battle of Bunker Hill, where they just march up in lines. I mean, it was a bit different, especially in this area. And there were no uniforms. I mean, they were wearing what they had. It was probably a lot of buckskin. Some of the typical pioneer that you would think of in your mind. We know that Ethan did have, he did actually have a nice, nice jacket, as time went on. But so that period of 1770 to 1775, they were running up and down the state more or less. And then meanwhile, they were also, building their homesteads, farming, and they had to have food, and they were trying to keep the New Yorkers off the land, whether they wanted to leave or not.
Must have been such an interesting time. I'm just trying to picture, what that was like. I mean, you on the one hand, you're living in this quiet, out of the way kind of place, but on the other hand, there's a lot of tensions in the air as to, who owns the place, who's running it, who do I have to pay taxes to, or all those things. Interesting. It's also the other thing I always find myself thinking about, just to kind of veer off the subject a little bit, is what the road network was like at the time. I mean, we talk about how they go from one place to another, but they didn't have asphalt roadways, and sometimes when I drive along, I look at and I see a little pathway going through the woods, and I wonder, was that the main drag there back in 1775 or what? But anyway, I mentioned that because I was thinking about it, because just to kind of jump forward a little bit, and we can talk a little bit about the actual march of Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys up to Ticonderoga. What's amazed me is that they got organized down in Connecticut, shortly after the Lexington Concord happened in mid-April of 1775. And they were able to organize, march all the way from Connecticut up through Massachusetts, up through Vermont without being detected. Now, I realize we didn't have the communications that we do now, but it was interesting that it sounds like what they did was they moved in sort of different groups. It wasn't like one big group of 200 or 300 guys marching together and up whatever the roadway might have been. I suppose that would have been 7A most of the way, but they would have veered off in certain parts. I guess just up the road here at Lathrop Lane, they probably would have gone up Lathrop Lane and along parallel to 7A, through the woods there, for instance, to think about these sort of ancient roads. But Ethan clearly understood the need for secrecy, and that, to travel in smaller groups was kind of part of their plan, because they got through Bennington, which was, I can't remember how many people were living in Bennington, but at least a couple of hundred.
Right.
And no one said anything to anybody in Albany saying, hey, something's going on. And Arlington is another interesting case, because Arlington was founded by a group of Episcopalians, which are very affiliated with the Church of England, and a lot of Tory sentiment there. But they passed through Arlington in these discrete groups, and none of the Tory sympathizers said, hey, we better get the word to so-and-so that something's going on here, and they better get on the alert, because Fort Ticonderoga really was the main outpost that was, kind of a British possession at the time. They had captured it from the French during the French and Indian War. It used to be Fort Carillon, I guess, was
Right.
the name. So it's kind of interesting that they were able to use, as you say, guerrilla tactics, secrecy, to get all the way up to Ticonderoga without being detected.
Right, and again, putting yourself in the mindset of what was it like in that period, 1775, that, when we think of Bennington, Shaftesbury, Sunderland, Arlington, Manchester, these were all just very small hamlets. And the roads connecting them, there were, dirt lanes, where we know the Route 7 corridor that we follow today, for instance, the Route 7 corridor as it goes past the Wilcox Flats, which is just a little bit north of where we're sitting right now. That part of Route 7 was moved further west in 1960. So it did, actually, Lathrop Lane was the main road, and it went right up through. And you can still, as you drive up, you can still see where that old road was. Well, where was the road that they traveled in 1775? Was it even further west, or was it? But we know it was probably generally up the middle of the valley, because the truth is we don't actually know for sure where the roads were, because the roads, time just passes on, and they say, and everything was the Valley Road. Okay, well, where was the Valley Road?
Right.
Right?
Right along the river?
Yeah, and exactly, and how did it snake, and the roads have moved even in the 20th century, sometimes significantly.
We do know, though, I think that once they got to Manchester, they took what's now the Manchester West Road.
Yeah,
And
we
to the
know
Dorset
that.
West Road?
Yeah, for instance, like the Weller Tavern. So there are these tangible markers along the way where we know, like the Weller Tavern. We know where that was because there's still an existing structure on there. So we definitely know that, which is just by Dellwood Cemetery. So we know they would have passed by that general area. The Marsh Tavern, which stood under the southern part of the Equinox Resort today. The Marsh Tavern was a real place that existed. The Council of Safety met there. We know they probably would have stayed there. There were several. Manchester had more taverns than certainly the meeting houses and or churches. So there are plenty of places for them to stop, and they came through in small bands. We know they came through a few days on the way, and which way did they go from Manchester to Castleton, which was the next rallying point, quote unquote. And they were picking up people along the way. This is where they picked up John Roberts and his 5 sons. So there were 6 alone just from the one family who picked up with Ethan and moved. Or I should say John Roberts and at least 3 of his sons, because 2 of his other sons lived in Dorset. So, did all the boys come down to Dad's place and all? We don't know. Did they go up through Dorset? Most likely some of them went Dorset. Did they continue straight up the valley and then, to Rutland and pick up more along the way? And when they went up through the Meadowy Valley, which we guess, exactly, did they go up the West Road? How far west was the West Road? That would have been the main drag, and going up through Dorset West Road and, where the Cephas Kent Tavern was. So we know they probably went through that general area and up Foot Road, which, because West Road is relatively new compared to Foot Road. So trying to recreate the exact place that we know, generally speaking. Okay, we know Equinox was there, we know Beartown was there, we know the Green Mountains. Those mountains, they would have looked up at those mountains, and they know they would have gone up through the center of the valley. So we can say with a straight face, undoubtedly, that they came up through this way. Mm-hmm. Some of them probably went up north, towards Rutland. Some of them probably went up through the Meadowy Valley in Dorset, no doubt about it. Which way did Ethan go? Where did he camp? Ethan Allen slept here. George Washington slept here. Again, there is the folklore of it too. And in folklore, there's always the kernels and seeds of truth. And, one of my goals here, as we talk about this, Andrew, is there are people who've spent their entire lives, finding out who these people were, their names, their ancestry, and those resources are available. Like I mentioned, the Descendants of the Green Mountain Boys, fantastic organizations, Sons of the American Revolutions, the Daughters of the American Revolutions. All of these organizations are out there serving a very specific purpose. So people are listening to this, say, well, I want more detail, and I want to know who these people were. That information is there, and it's, it's been documented, sometimes painstakingly documented, of looking at rosters and any glimpse of who these people were, where they lived, who they married, where they were born, where they died. So that part of the history to me is always fascinating. But when we come back to the March to Ticonderoga, we generally know the story. Do we know exactly where they went? Do we know exactly how they went? No, because it's all fragmented pieces of oral history. I mean, the Cephas Kent Tavern in Dorset, like they still don't. They know generally where it was, but they're not sure. It's not like the Marsh Tavern where we know where it was through land records and enough oral histories and accounts and people who were able to tell exactly where it was versus Cephas Kent. There's a marker there that's been changed, I think, at least 3 or 4 times.
Wow, that's really amazing to think, because our understanding of what happened and the importance of it all is really conditioned to a large degree on, well, what did happen? How do we know that for sure? And the understanding of it just shifts if our sources of information are, well, they're probably reliable, but not maybe 100%.
Well, therein lies one of the issues that we have as we look back, because you look at these papers or these books that have been written that are almost like, people are considered the sacred texts, and then you find more information saying, well, that's not really how it happened. And and it's such a slippery slope, because a lot of these people, it's like the myth of it. They become legends, and then, well, who were these people? And this isn't to say that that you need to break them down, because they were just they were extraordinary people living their lives. And as we learn more information, as we try to, well, what really happened, it doesn't mean we're trying to tear them down. At least I'm not trying to tear them down, nor am I trying to rewrite history. But it's just also kind of frame it that, there is a great story here, and some of it we just don't know. I mean, we know they went that away.
And they got there.
And they got there. And at the end of the day, that's what happened.
Yeah.
And the fact that they did this without phones, they did this that they were able to move. And you think about the shot heard round the world in Lexington, Concord, and then you go today, which they would have known it. The smoke would have still been in the air when the southern shores of Lake Champlain would have been notified of it. Back then, the British garrison there had no idea.
Yeah, it's really incredible when you think about it. But anyway, so they made that march and got up to Ticonderoga, and Ethan Allen may or may not have said by the Continental Congress and Great Jehovah, I'm taking this over. So it might have been apocryphal, maybe not. Who knows? We don't know. But the bottom line was, yes, they captured Fort Ticonderoga. You could say the first victory ever by what came to be the United States. This would have been May 10th or so on 1775. And the importance, of course, was that there were a lot of cannons there that were able to be shipped down to Boston for the siege of Boston to help break the British hold in that city. But then, of course, the aftermath of it all was in 1777. The British recaptured Fort Ticonderoga because the colonists were stretched so thin they couldn't hold it, and that was part of the campaign that went down the Hudson River, wound up to Saratoga, where they were stopped there. Then, of course, prior to that, there was the Battle of Bennington, which will also be commemorating as part of this whole 250 series in August of 1777. It's just the whole saga is really quite remarkable, and I will be hearing a lot more about it in the next few days and weeks. And then on through until 2027, when we sort of study the Battle of Bennington in probably more greater detail. But I guess we could probably just leave it there for now. Was there anything else we're going to add here to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest part that I wanted to reiterate was, as we got together and, we're doing this and telling a story and trying to, set the table, is to also recognize, that the story itself is it's miraculous that they were able to pull this off. And that, in 1775, that basically a group of Vermont farmers, were able to, coordinate themselves to basically, move up and, take this significant fort, from the British. Total surprise. And the part for me as someone who lives in this valley is, Christopher Roberts, and John was the father, and Christopher, who was, I think, the second youngest, he's considered to be at least the third man into the fort behind Ethan, and some accounts say that he helped guide Ethan there. They've lived out their lives in Manchester, and there's more to the story of what they did. And some of the other Roberts brothers, fought at the Battle of Bennington. Christopher was involved with it, and continued their duties to the colonies. But at the end of the day, they ended up living and are buried right up here in Dellwood Cemetery, and they were real people, and who did extraordinary things. And the idea that people can dig more into this and tell their children, of all these moving parts and small towns and hamlets of how this all came together to have, basically what would become the United States. And to me, that is just endlessly fascinating.
And you think also what an incredible sacrifice it must have been, because if you're a farmer, that means you're working a lot, right?
Right.
These guys had to leave their farms right at the start of the growing season, I guess, right?
Right.
And go off on this crazy adventure that was like, oh, okay, and they would have to leave, their kids, their families, just go
Everything.
off. And on an adventure that may or may not have proved successful. I mean, when you stop and think that what they were taking on was the British Empire, or what it was referred to at the time, that must have been a rather kind of like, oh my God kind of moment for some of these guys to think. I mean, is this crazy?
Right. And the other thing, there's so many rabbit holes, Andrew. But
yeah, I know.
But when you think, we spent the better part of the last 25 minutes talking about the Green Mountain Boys. Well, you know what? Those Green Mountain Boys, all those Green Mountain Boys, they were married. So when they were off doing all this, the wives were at home with the children, still living in frontier land, so to speak. There actually were wolves in this area. There were, there still was the threat of the indigenous people who were really unhappy at the time, for the most part. And then you had
not unreasonably so.
And then you had New York posses coming over here,
right.
Who could come over and basically, evict or throughout the entire family. So these men were leaving to go, and it wasn't like, all right, we're going up there, we'll be home by 4 tomorrow. I mean, they'd be gone for days, weeks, and they're leaving their wives at home.
And maybe they wouldn't make it back at all.
And sometimes they wouldn't make it back at all. And and it's not like they could communicate with them, because they'd just be gone, and they'd have to wait and see when they were coming back, and hopefully they would come back in one piece. And I don't want to overlook what their contributions were to all of this, because that stress. Okay, they weren't there. Are they going to be able to make it across the channel? Are they going to wake up the sentries? Will there be shots fired? They're saying, how are we going to feed the kids? Is my husband coming home?
Right.
So, and there is more to that story too to think about.
Well, and perhaps one we'll get to in another time, but why don't we leave it there for today, Shawn? We're going to be having the 250 events coming up early May, and great opportunities for people to really dive into all this further. One of the things I'm looking forward to is the events down at the Galusha Farm. A house I drove by multiple times, never thought about it. and it's right there just in northern Shaftesbury on the right-hand side of the road as you're heading south towards Shaftesbury. And boy, a lot of stuff happened there, and a lot of stuff will be happening there on May 3rd. It's funny, the first time I really became aware of it was I had a conversation once with former Governor Jim Douglas, who went down there to help dedicate the historical marker.
Mm-hmm.
And I had never heard of Governor Galusha, but apparently he served, I think, 7 terms, if I remember the conversation correctly. And Governor Douglas was saying about how, he was going to go down and, dedicate the marker at the Galusha House, and we got talking about Jonas Galusha. And
Yeah,
he
the
was-
whole Galusha family, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating.
Yeah, so it's all right there. We just go right by it so often, and it's quite interesting.
Well, that's what's important to have these things because somebody has to remember what are those green plaques? Well, there's actually a story there.
Right. Big time stuff happened. History happened here. All right. Well, we'll leave it there for today, folks. Thanks an awful lot for being with us. This is Nothing is New, our little deep dive into the rabbit holes of history that tell us why things are happening today the way they are. Anyway, we'll see you again the next time. Thanks to Shawn Harrington, the curator of the Manchester Historical Society, and Paige Vignola, the assistant director of the Manchester Community Library, will be back with us next time. And, we'll talk to you then. Take care.